From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me is Dr. Luana Ferreira, who's a linguist, educator, and host of the podcast Bocona, All Things Dominican. In this conversation, we'll talk about growing up in the Dominican community in New York, as well as in the Dominican Republic. We'll discuss some of the characteristics of the Dominican variety of Spanish, and we'll talk about how her podcast is seeking to amplify, uplift, center, and empower Dominican voices. Here's my conversation with Luana Ferreira. Luana Ferreira, thank you so much for coming here today.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate you being here. You are the host of a podcast called La Bocona Podcast. And can you tell us what that podcast is about?
So thank you for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here at Columbia University International Affairs. I'm so excited. So Bocona, All Things Dominican is a podcast that I created to sort of diffuse negative associations relating to Dominicans, Dominican culture. So what we do is we underscore Dominican excellence. We speak a little bit about everything from academics to pop culture. And our motto is that we amplify, uplift, center, and empower Dominican voices. So that's our little project of love. I host with what I call my compinche co-host, Cari Cruz. Shout out to her. We try to target Dominican students, college students, because we find that many of them come into higher learning having a sense of what Dominican means, of Dominicanness, but not a profound sense of their history, their identity. They're very proud to be the Dominican. But I find that our podcast resonates in that we do many, many different tidbits from history to music to a little bit of politics, not so much. But, But it's just to highlight positivity.
Yeah, I discovered your podcast pretty early on as I was doing this podcast here. And I have to say, I kind of took some inspiration from the way in which your podcast tries to shine the spotlight on some issues that might not necessarily be part of the New York Times conversation, or
of course,
the conversation that some people.
Oh,
might
thank
be
you.
So,
that's so nice.
Yeah, in this podcast.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, sure. We're trying to show different languages, different cultures, and talk about what's contained within these cultures. And so, I guess to that point, I wanted to. Maybe we can, as we do with many of the conversations on this podcast, talk a little bit about your background, talk a little bit about where you grew up, how you grew up, and sort of how you came to be having this real powerful sense that you wanted to host a podcast that empowers people and helps them frame their self-understanding. So where did you grow up, and talk a little bit about your early life?
Sure. So I was born in Washington Heights. They call it Inwood now, but growing up, that was Washington Heights, Dyckman,
Dyckman Street.
So Dyckman Street, but when you say that you're from Dyckman or that one is from Dyckman, Dyckman is like a neighborhood or in a state of mind. So I say, oh, I'm from Dyckman. I live 2 blocks away from Dyckman. So I grew up, and I'm still living in that part of Washington Heights, Inwood, whatever people call it nowadays. When I was 9, I left to the Dominican Republic. My parents decided to go back, and my formative years were spent in the Dominican Republic, being educated in Spanish, going to Dominican schools. And there are a lot of people in my generation that did that, like sort of like this reverse retiring or an early retirement, but not really, because my parents did work in the Dominican Republic. My dad did. So there was an economic collapse because Dominicans, many Dominican immigrants into the U.S. went back and put all of their money in these sort of like financial institutions that ended up being Ponzi schemes. And it wiped communities, and they had to come back to particularly New York.
And what period
work.
Was this?
This was the 80s.
Okay.
This was the 80s. So after 8 years of living and being schooled in the Dominican Republic, I came back to complete my last year of high school at Brandeis High School, which is not far from Columbia. Mm-hmm. It's on 84th and Amsterdam Public School. However, even when I had a basic knowledge of English, reading like these little novels, Sweet Valley High, my English was not academic enough. So this is a story that I always say. My combined SAT score did not make me a desirable candidate
Me neither.
for higher education, right? Like Columbia was not knocking on my door. I was barely accepted into state colleges because of programs that helped kids like me, like the Educational Opportunity Program. And because my English sucked, basically, there's no way to put it. There's no sophisticated way to put it. I actually ended up majoring in Spanish because it was the only thing that I was good at. I was feeling like a failure. My grades were also it was a roller. My transcript is like a literal roller coaster.
Yeah.
As a freshman, I was already taking very high level college courses in Latin American literature. Then I graduated, and guess what I did? I moved back to the Dominican Republic for 5 more years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
To just take a break from New York.
Yeah.
So that's where I started my teaching career, teaching American schools. And then I came back, and it's been many, many, many years since that. So that's my story in a nutshell. But I'm happy to say that I'm still living in the neighborhood that I grew up loving, where I did my first communion, got my first library card. I live across the street from the park where I played as a child. So I'm happy to still be there and going strong.
Yeah.
A block away from my parents, by the way.
And your parents, do they live in New York, or do they live in the
No, they live in New York.
Oh, they do? Okay.
We finally moved back in 1989 together.
Yeah. So really, you have your home is in 2 places, it seems. Is that right, or not? How do you think of it?
Life in 2 islands.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Hey,
Yep.
there you go.
Well, culturally, I'm very Dominican.
Okay.
But socially and lifestyle, I've been told that I'm very much a New Yorker at heart. So how fortunate that I can navigate these 2 worlds, 2 very, very different islands.
Do you perceive that you are a different person in the New York world, the English-speaking New York world, and a different person in the Spanish-speaking world of the Dominican Republic, and maybe even a third person in the Spanish-speaking Dominican community of New York City? How do these, is it a continuity? Is it different sort of masks that you put on? How do you think about it for yourself?
That is such a good question, because when I have friends that visit me from the Dominican Republic, they are in awe to see me as a New Yorker. And I had a friend that he said, "You're so Dominican, but you're such a New Yorker." So they've seen that sort of like way that I manage the cultural components that are tied to language. There are cultural competencies that I manage when I'm with my Dominican family, Dominican friends from the island, and also Dominicans in New York, but also this non-Hispanic, non-Latino New York world. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have been told that I have a New York accent, supposedly. I don't know if that's true, but it comes out when I speak to other New Yorkers.
Right. Yeah.
But I guess it's a function. When you're bilingual, there's cultural competency attached to that kind of bilingualism. And especially when it comes to Spanish, the Spanish that I speak when I'm among Dominicans is certainly not the kind of Spanish that I speak when I'm among Mexicans. So yeah, there's definitely a way to sort of like culturally code switch in a linguistic way that adapts to the speaker.
And makes you sort of able to switch between these different audiences.
Like a chameleon.
Like a chameleon, yeah.
However, I have to say that when you are identified as not being part of a speech community, especially when that speech community comes with privileges to belong to that speech community. Mm-hmm. And it does a number psychologically when I'm at job interviews. I'm like, oh my God, did I make a mistake? It taps into my linguistic insecurities about my fluency in the English language. So
Yeah.
I hope that answered your question.
Yeah,
That was a
it does.
long-winded
No, we
answer.
we love long-winded answers on this podcast.
Good.
Um, so I wonder, could you talk a little bit about the neighborhood in which you grew up? So there's different names for that area.
Hmm.
Washington Heights, Dyckman. Now
Right.
people call it Inwood.
Yeah. So for me, one of the things that I love about growing up in where I live is the sense of warmth that you find and the diversity within our very own community. You know, there's age diversity. You have senior citizens either playing dominoes outside. That's a very typical thing that you might see, or just sitting at the park. Then you have the kids playing Little League, which is the cutest thing ever because, of course, Dominicans, you know, we are fans of baseball. And then now with this huge, I think we're up to 4 now in the Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
Now with Big Papi, yes, they're you know, Boston Red Sox, but if you're Dominican into the Hall of Fame, that's the one time that Yankee fans will forgive the Red Sox. So it's the diversity in how we live life, how we treat each other. I'll give you an example. A lot of people don't favor like young people hanging out on the streets. You know, they call it loitering, and it's like, well, let's look a little bit deeper. When you don't have youth centers or programs, where else is the youth going to go? And my parents' building caught fire, and they were the first ones who ran door to door to door to evacuate everybody. So it's this sense of value for people, for culture, and I just love it. And I love the fact that I can eat my food in my neighborhood, but also, you know, I oscillate between what it means to be Dominican and be more of a broader New Yorker. Like sometimes I find myself craving, you know, a bagel with lox. So I got to go to Delancey and go to Russ and Daughters, you know.
Yeah.
So I guess
Gotcha.
that's in a nutshell.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your educational background? I know you have a Ph.D. in Hispanic linguistics.
Yeah. I have a Ph.D., a doctorate in Hispanic linguistics from the CUNY Graduate Center. I went all the way because that's the kind of message that I got at home, that get educated, get educated, get educated. So, you know, the Spanish language is something that I'm really, really passionate about. I also have certifications in elementary education and bilingual education, all of that. I actually taught bilingual education for 5 years right here at Teachers College, a block away. So then I thought that the next step was to get, after my master's in education, to get a PhD in something.
Yeah, sure. And so you wrote a dissertation, and what was your dissertation about?
So I do something called lexical density. It is a statistical framework that measures lexical inventories. I decided that for my dissertation, I was going to compare Spanish print media newspapers that were published in the US against those published in Latin America, just to see and observe the lexical differences and if they were mutually intelligible. And then it turns out that all of my samples, it was all comparable. There wasn't this contamination of language, quote unquote contamination, by the excess use of English words in, let's say, the Spanish print media in the US. And it gained so much traction that I got a mention from La Real Academia Española. So,
wow. So just to...
that was an honor.
So you are responding to, in this dissertation, the idea that there's a kind of lesser version of Spanish being used in print media printed in the United States, and you found that that's not the case.
That's not the case now. There's always this debate that Spanish in the U.S. is not perfect, it's contaminated. So then I went straight to the source. I mean, actually, my corpora are newspapers, and I compared the 3 most circulated Spanish newspapers in the U.S. I compared those to the top 3 circulated newspapers in Mexico and South America. And it turns out that the incidence of, let's say, one component that I observed, which is English lexicon, less than 1%. So
that
clearly
premise,
La Real Academia was very pleased
yeah,
by that.
sure, yeah.
Actually, it was also published, so
Oh wow,
I will get you your copy.
I'd
I forgot
love
to bring it today.
Yeah, I'd love to read it.
It's in Spanish, though.
Oh, okay.
So you got to learn Spanish first.
I'll learn Spanish first. Well, actually, I do have a question about that. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Dominican variety of Spanish and sort of some of its characteristics, how it fits in with other varieties of Spanish, and maybe, can you just sort of lay out a little bit, how you would describe it?
Sure. So Dominican Spanish is known for one phenomenon, which is the aspiration of the sibilant. It means that the sound that we know as s, right? We're not talking about letters. We're talking about sounds, right? If the written word did not exist, language would still be spoken. So that's why linguists, as you know, we speak of sounds and not letters. So Dominicans are notorious for either aspirating or eliminating the s sound altogether, particularly when it's end of syllable. So of course, if the word starts with s, we don't eliminate that, but if it's mid-word, we tend to do it. This is the same phenomenon that Andalusians do. Right? So I'll give you an example. So we can say, for example, instead of saying discoteca, we'll say discoteca. So the s is still there, but is a little bit, it has a soft sound, right?
Yeah. I've heard people say gracia instead of gracias.
Gracia.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Right?
And that's an
End of the
example of
word.
what
That's
you're
an
talking
example
about.
of it. But
Yeah.
that's when you eliminate it altogether.
Okay, yeah.
Now, here's what I love. The most educated Dominicans will do this phenomenon. This is not something that is a function of how highly educated you are. This is just our natural speech. William Labov talks about a covert prestige, meaning that if you're doing too much of this, Dominicans will shame you for it and
Right.
call you fisna.
What's that
Like,
mean?
oh, the real word is fina,
Oh, okay.
like sophisticated.
I
So
get it.
fisna, we put in that extra S, like,
Yeah.
oh, look at her with all of her.
Yeah.
So even our natural form of speech is celebrated
Right.
by fellow Dominicans. And we have come to this agreement that if you put too many S's, all of your S's, like Mexicans do, then you're deemed as not Dominican. Like, no, like, who are you trying to impress? The only way that we find this acceptable is if you're a public speaker, if you're a news anchor. That's when, okay, now you can do all the way.
Okay.
But when we're talking, it's like, look at you. You're putting all your S's where they belong. So I think it's one of the most distinct characteristics. So if you're talking about the northern part of the island where I grew up, which is El Cibao, it's a valley with the most fertile land. We have a phenomenon called vocalizing the liquid consonant sounds. So L and R, LR, right?
Yeah,
For those
yeah.
that are listening, right? So we have a way that if there is an L or an R mid-syllable, we change that to an I. So instead of saying nervioso, we'll say nervioso. And we have very educated, highly educated people that talk like this.
Yeah.
Now, this phenomenon is not new because Brazilians already do this when they say Brasil instead of Brasil,
Gotcha.
right?
Yeah.
So that's another Dominican phenomenon that is very distinct to that area. And I've been told that when I'm with my family, it's like la Cibaeña, Cibao, that's the region. That's another characteristic.
Are there lexical items? Are there words that are only a part of Dominican Spanish that are not part of other varieties of Spanish?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you give an example of?
Sure. There have been studies, for example, of how urban music and English becomes this vehicle for linguistic innovation for Dominican speakers of Spanish. I'll give you one right now. Josear. That comes from hustling.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So when somebody you see an exchange and somebody has like several jobs or little jobs, or they're picking up like a quick makeshift job, hey, what are you doing? Aquí joseando a dos manos. And it's, yeah. So josear is one. Let's see. Wow, you're putting me to think right now.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
so many, and now I can't even
Right.
produce. But that's something that is appropriate to Dominican Americans.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
kind of lexical inventory
Yeah.
where it's been permeated by the English language and the fact that Spanish is in contact with English here in the U.S. But I can. Oh, okay. I have one that is Dominican. Fajao. So faja means girdle. It should be fajado with a D, but nobody says that.
Okay.
So fajao means that you're working like a dog.
Yeah.
So how are you doing? Aquí fajao. Like, but you can also be, dancing fajao, like
Okay.
se fajó a bailar. It's like a verb, fajarse.
Right. Right.
So
it
él
means
se
to go
fajó
hard.
To go hard.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah. So that's a good one.
I love this kind of thing. I think it's so neat. It's been fascinating to hear about some of the uniqueness of Dominican Spanish, but I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that speakers of Dominican Spanish face and some of the prejudices that they face, especially in the academic context?
The problem that I find is that there's this stigma that if you are from Spain, then that means that you have to be a better speaker of Spanish than XYZ community or this particular speech community. You might even, there's even another phenomenon that, people that study abroad that are American monolinguals and they study abroad in Spain, Mexico, they have to be better speakers than Latino, educated Latino, US Latinos. I have encountered all of those challenges when I was searching for jobs in academia, when I was being interviewed, both to teach Spanish as a foreign language and also bilingual education. And then there's the complaint that there are no qualified Dominican speakers, and that's just bullshit. I just think that the way that the system has been planned is to continue giving certain communities privilege at the expense of others. And it's the way that people look, the way that people sound. If you use too many English words, and I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
People that want to hire Spanish professors, Spanish interpreters, all of that, they're looking for a certain profile. And that profile gets disguised as you have to be native or native-like, right? Anybody that is educated in Spanish, academically educated, bilingual, biliterate, will speak fluent academic Spanish. And for me, the question is, what is the social perception of people who are Spanish speakers? A Spanish professor or Spanish teacher, how does that person look? Or what is the social perception? Because I can tell you as a Dominican, we are at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to speakers of the social perception of what constitutes a perfect speaker of the Spanish language. The flip side to that is that when people hear me speak, they can't believe it. I've been called so many things, like backhanded compliments, that it's like, oh, look at you. Like, you don't sound Dominican. So there's a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to these laundry lists of diversity benchmarks that one has to meet, and what's on paper and the actual execution of hiring a professor, an interpreter, because we're here, you know, and I'm in it. And part of my podcast is to underscore Dominican scholars that we can stop it with this complaint that there are no qualified people in the pool. You know, it's like, we are qualified. You just want somebody that looks a certain way, that talks a certain way. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
it seems to me like what you're saying is we talk about diversity in hiring, but from my perception and from what you're saying, it's a kind of imagined diversity and not real diversity.
Oh, I love it. I love how you say that. I totally agree.
And
I
it's
totally agree.
and so I think that what you're doing with your podcast is you're advocating for a diversity that is not just imagined by some institution, but
Right. Or
one
even
that is,
performative.
yeah, or performative. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit about your podcast and some of the topics that it goes into?
Sure.
So can you again review the tagline of the podcast?
Yeah. Amplify, uplift, center, and empower Dominican voices. It's called Bocona, All Things Dominican. And Bocona means loudmouth
Okay.
in Spanish. So it is very apropos because I've always been told that I'm a loudmouth, that I'm opinionated, that I need to play this game. And, I did it for a while. I played the game in academia. I tried my best to fit in. And then I decided to just create my own platform and have my own voice. And what I do is I represent that part of Dominicans that had the privilege to grow up in the Dominican Republic. And by privilege, I don't mean that I was wealthy. I mean that I was lucky to actually grow up in the Dominican Republic. But of course, that came at a cost because it affected my English language. And thus, I couldn't get into the colleges that I really wanted to go to because of my SAT scores. So, we speak a little bit about what does that look like in terms of how do you support students through their educational journeys. And then Kari represents the Dominican that grew up
Mm,
here
yeah,
in New
yeah,
York
right.
and maybe gets to go to the island maybe once a year, maybe once every 2 years, and so forth. So, what we try to do in the podcast is to underscore Dominican excellence, to talk about history, and to talk about how influential the Dominican community is. And it's basically to dismantle this notion that there are no Dominican this.
Hmm.
So we try to shine light on the positive things that the community is doing. Sometimes certain topics could be a bit controversial. There's this urban singer called Tokisha, who is really breaking barriers in terms of women and female sexuality. And she made it into the New York Times. So there's a little bit of controversy there because she's not, she ruffles people that are a bit more conservative, a bit more highbrow. But for me, the fact that she made it into the New York Times, that to me merits a discussion,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? But we also speak about Michel Camilo, who is a Grammy Award winning jazz pianist. We speak about how the person who might finally find Cleopatra's tomb is a Dominican by the name of Kathleen Martinez.
Oh, cool.
So we really want to bring light to people that would most likely say, I didn't know Dominicans did this. I didn't know
Yeah.
there was a Dominican. So
So you're saying
because
we're here and this is what we're
we're
doing.
here because nobody's doing it for us. When it comes to negative stereotypes, everybody wants to jump on that bandwagon and highlight and underscore negativity. But then those stories, those success stories, nobody's telling those stories except for those of us that are immersed, that are either Dominican or immersed in Dominican culture.
I'm a listener of Bocona, All Things Dominican, and I really appreciate the variety of guests and topics that you have on. And in my opinion, it's really important work that you're doing, and there's a lot going on underneath the surface. So, in your own mind, how would you characterize the deeper purpose and really the mission of your podcast?
I think what we're trying to find is where does Dominican culture and Dominican identity intersect in our society,
Yeah.
in our American society. And for example, one thing that people don't know is that, the day to halt violence against women was in honor of 3 Dominican women that died protesting the dictator Trujillo. A lot of people don't know that. And imagine we have this day, this global day, which is in the UN, in the United Nations, and people don't even know that it was in honor of 3 Dominican women. So if there's a Dominican involved, then I'm going to use my platform to put it forth,
Yeah.
to say it and to underscore it. we need that visibility. We need people that are aspirational and can tell us that, yeah, we can make it. We can climb those ladders. Those spaces are meant for us.
Well, Dr. Luana
Oh,
Ferreira.
please call me Luana.
Luana, I really appreciate you coming here and joining me on talking about these topics. Your podcast is
Bocona, All Things Dominican.
Bocona, All Things Dominican, and I recommend everybody go and listen to it. I've really enjoyed listening to it myself.
It's spelled Bocona.
And we'll put a link to it in the description.
Fantastic. Thank you
Great.
so much.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful afternoon. Now I have to go to kick off the Dominican Day Parade.
Whoa. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure.